Let's talk about 3D printing, also called additive manufacturing. What kind of growth do you think is being forecast for this industry?
Well, that is, I think, a perfect example of one of these technologies where there are very few, a handful of distributors who are doing much with additive manufacturing 3D printing today. There's very few who are selling either the equipment or the filament or the other supplies on their websites. Very few who have a machine on site that they're using. But to me, that is one of the technologies that has some really, really fascinating potential. The growth rates very much depends on who you talk to. There's a company out there called Wohlers Associates, and they've positioned themselves as sort of the preeminent analysts on 3D printing. And they've put some numbers out there that the industry is likely to grow at 20 to 30% a year and grow into a multi-billion dollar industry very, very quickly in the next couple of years. Other people who you talk to, CSFB, for example, the investment bank, came out with a very, very long report on 3D printing, and they were suggesting that 20 to 30% growth rate is extremely conservative, and they looked at just a few of the potential application areas and are seeing much, much greater growth potential, more around the 30 to 50% growth rate. I think if you look at where 3D printing is being used today and you extrapolate from that, you can certainly see how those 30 to 50% growth rates are not so unreasonable. I mean, if you are in need of a hearing aid today, the vast majority of hearing aids are 3D printed. A lot of dental implants now are 3D printed. A rapidly growing number of medical devices, so a knee replacement, a hip replacement, those types of joints are going to be 3D printed. And that's just in the medical business. And if you look at the growth rates just in terms of knee replacements in the US, for example, over the next few years, huge, huge growth projected. And if all of that becomes 3D printed, that one facet of the industry can probably account for a 20% overall growth rate in all of 3D printing. But then when you extrapolate that out to other industrial products like jet engines, all of a sudden those growth rates very, very quickly get up to 30 to 50%. So I think it very much remains to be seen what the numbers are, but it is going to be big. And I think to me the only question is what role are distributors going to play in that industry? It's interesting, if you look on Amazon Supply's website, they are already selling 3D printing machines, and they're already selling 3D printing supplies.
I understand it's also already having an effect on research and development processes. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's certainly turning a lot of those traditional processes on their head in terms of how quickly companies can develop and test prototypes of different types, whereas in the past a prototype may have taken weeks and a lot of specialist expertise to develop, and then you develop a prototype and then you have to send it around to multiple manufacturing sites or designers or stakeholders. You can now, with 3D printing, you come up with your prototype, you take either a 3D photograph of that or you have the file with the design spec, and you can send that file around the world in seconds. And you could have your manufacturing partner in China, you could have your design people in California, and you could have your customer in North Carolina all printing out that part at the same time and testing it for their own specific considerations. And so I think as you look across metal, plastic, ceramics, medical devices, the ability of companies to share prototypes in a whole new way far more quickly is really going to turn a lot of traditional manufacturing supply chains on their head.
I know you've also mentioned that at some point in the future it may become economically feasible for distributors to actually bring manufacturing capabilities in-house. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I see that, Angela, as being one of the real interesting potential areas for distributors to consider in their strategic planning exercise. And that is to say, the products that we source today from our various suppliers, what if, and it's a what if question, what if we could buy 1, 2, 5, 10 3D printers and start printing out those products as we need them rather than storing them on our shelf for 30, 40, 60, 90 days, having maybe a 1 month lead time from the manufacturer in terms of how quickly they can fulfill them, and then add in their time frames on their own supply chain. And all of a sudden, the distributor might be able to have a 3D printer in their warehouse, be able to print out a part as needed, rather than looking at maybe a 180 or 360 days end-to-end supply chain for a particular part in today's world. So I see that as being a huge potential opportunity. And then you add on to that the ability to either customize, personalize, or localize some of those products as needed, including right down to putting the distributor's logo or other branding on those products. I think it just creates a lot of exciting opportunities for distributors to think very, very differently about what business they're in. Now, it's not going to be every product, it's not going to be every material, and it's certainly not going to be something that everyone jumps into immediately. But the ability to do that creates some very powerful what-if questions that I think distributors need to be thinking about today and stay close to.
It could be a new market opportunity for distributors.
I see it as being a huge opportunity for them. As distributors have looked around for value-added services opportunities over the last 60, 70 years, the services that have typically been developed have very quickly become commodities. And something like 3D printing and the ability to develop your own capabilities around that, I think the companies that take the high ground on that and build that capability quickly, could really create some meaningful separation in the marketplace with those skills. So I see it as being a huge opportunity. It will likely create a lot of channel conflict, right? Because the distributor now could be 3D printing parts that they have purchased from some of their key suppliers. So the relationships with suppliers could change quite dramatically, or the relationship might just take a different form, and instead of the supplier sending truckloads of parts to the distributor's warehouse, maybe they're sending over a file with a licensing agreement, and the manufacturer's business changes quite dramatically, and instead of being a manufacturer now, the supplier becomes a design company that is selling designs that are able to be used on 3D printers to their distributors. It's not that the sky's the limit here, but I think we have to think very, very differently about the supply chains that we deal with today in light of something like 3D printing. There's a lot of pushback on how relevant and how quickly this technology will get up to speed. And people talk about the speed of the 3D printers and the cost of it and the cost of the filaments and the ability to print a very tightly spec'd product. But all of those barriers seem to be falling away pretty quickly. And again, if you look at the end-to-end supply chain and all the costs in terms of manufacturing a product halfway around the world and shipping it to a North American warehouse where it sits for 60 days, and you start to add in all the costs associated with that versus printing it, I think the economics in a lot of cases start to become pretty compelling.